This is the Impressions Exchange podcast.
Impressions Exchange podcast,
where all topics impacting the graphic imaging and printing industry are addressed via in-depth news coverage, analysis, and timely interviews.
Welcome to the Impressions Exchange podcast. In this episode, Editor-in-Chief Mark Michelson joins us to talk about the legendary Printing Impressions annual ranking of the largest printing companies in the US and Canada as ranked by annual sales. We discuss how the list has changed since its inception 40 years ago, what it takes to put together a list of this caliber, some of the trends over the past few years, and how the list has impacted the printing industry and beyond. Hey, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to bring you on the podcast to talk about the annual ranking that we do. It is such a massive project. And so much goes into it, and it is so highly anticipated every year, and has made such an impact that I think it would be kind of interesting if we talk about what goes into making the list and your experience with it. And as you know, we just marked our 40th anniversary with it, our 40th year doing it. So I'd love to hear, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen since the ranking began in 1983?
Well, as you say, to me, it's just hard to believe it's 40 years, but that's a whole nother story. But longtime readers of the magazine would know that it actually was the Printing Impressions 500 for many years. Then, due to industry consolidation, it dropped down to the Printing Impressions 400 for many years, because once a company is acquired, that company no longer appears on the list. So, there is going to be constant attrition there. Then, largely due to the pandemic, which drove consolidation down, and even for the companies that remained in business were struggling from a revenue standpoint. So then in 2020, we dropped it down to the Printing Impressions 350, and then in 2021, the Printing Impressions 300. So the list has gotten shorter over the years, and certainly the pandemic drove it down twice. In terms of trends on the list over the years, certainly in the earlier years, a lot of the companies were publicly held. Over time, there's less of that. There were also a lot of what I would consider mega deals or mega mergers that happened. And back in those earlier years, I think there was less scrutiny from an antitrust standpoint. We saw in more recent time when the LSC Quad merger was blocked by antitrust reasons. But if you look back over the course of many years of the list itself, I think that was less of a concern. We also saw trends of several roll-up companies. The most well-known and I guess famous, and really maybe the most successful one, was Consolidated Graphics, led by Joe Davis, which ultimately was acquired by R.R. Donnelley. Also, in terms of types of printers, there used to be financial printers, and that's all they did. Companies like Sorg and many others that just went out of business, it seemed like overnight. We had a lot of printers that separated themselves by quality, doing high-end brochures, catalogs, annual reports. Companies like Anderson Litho, the Hennigan Company, Acme Printing. There certainly was an era in our industry where quality was, and craft skill, I think, really could separate certain companies from others. But technology over time and more automation, I think, leveled the playing field. So those companies that were able to sell or to do things like annual reports and these high-end auto brochures and things like that and be able to charge a premium for it. Unfortunately, that kind of went away as technology and made it so that every printer could really buy the same equipment. And yes, there still are quality differences, but not like they were at one time. And another trend I've seen on the list in more recent years is really the convergence that's taking place in the industry. There used to be lines of demarcation that separated printers from each other. You had a commercial printer, you had somebody that specialized in wide format packaging, many other segments. And those lines of demarcation have really merged together. And you've got printers that are getting into all other kinds of markets. And, I think that's been one of the key drivers of the Printing United Expo. What's made that successful, to have all the markets covered under one roof, so to speak. So certainly that trend of printing companies moving into other markets and revenue streams, even promotional products, things like that, has certainly been a trend that's reflected on the list in the last really recent, even several years. So, even just looking back, I kind of pulled out our Hall of Fame. We induct 4 printers into our Hall of Fame every year, and that's been going on since 1985, and I just pulled up the names. I'm not going to name the people that were inducted, but if you just look at the companies that these individuals represented, and I'm just going to rattle off some names, and it's kind of remarkable that none of these companies exist anymore. They exist maybe in terms of they were acquired by another company, but in terms of, by the name that they once had, they're gone. Companies like World Color Press, Standard Register, General Business Forms, Danbury Printing and Litho, the Bedore Companies, Wallace Computer Services, W.A. Krieger, Cadmus, Continental Graphics, Sullivan Graphics, Moore Corporation, Perry Printing, Form Service Company, the Hennigan Company, which I mentioned earlier, Judd's Inc., Quebecor Inc., Meehan Tooker, Graphic Industries, Kukla Press, MetroWeb, Avanti Case Hoyt, Applied Graphics Technologies, Courier Corporation, Rainbow Graphics, Applied Graphics Technologies, Great Lakes Lithograph, Williamson Printing, Spencer Press, Printing Arts America, Lehigh Press, Web Crafters, Press of Ohio, Edwards Brothers, Times Printing, Publishers Printing, Virtus, Angstrom Graphics, Ovid Bell Press, Stevenson Printing, Pictorial Offset, Paget Printing, the Garvey Group, Classic Graphics. Those are just to name some. And, many of those companies were industry behemoths at one time. Right. And the fact that those names have gone away in the laurels of printing industry history, to me, it's kind of remarkable. But then, looking at, say, the current list, and even really for the last several years, the thing that's remarkable to me is private equity that's moved into our industry. I think something like on our most recent ranking, at least 6 of the top 25 companies are owned by private equity firms. Wow. Companies like Chatham Asset Management, Atlas Holdings, Cerberus Capital Management, ICV Partners, just to name a few. So that's obviously been a huge trend in our industry. And, from my standpoint, I understand it does provide an exit strategy for some privately held companies, maybe family business. Our industry is such a capital intensive industry. It's really hard to keep up and private equity, the infusion of capital that they put into companies. The long-term ramifications of how private equity is going to impact our industry, I think that remains to be seen. So we will, maybe it won't be me that will be commenting about that someday, but I'm sure we will look back and see how private equity is changed and will change our industry.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, just I can't believe, and you said it was just a number of companies from that Hall of Fame list, and not all of them. And that just so many companies that, don't exist, and how the list has changed so much. And I wasn't, here when the list started, but it sounds like, there has been gradually this kind of large shift toward private equity firms coming in, and some companies, merging or ceasing to exist. But there's some positive things there too.
Right.
Sounds like so.
Yeah, and I mean, probably the biggest private equity was R.R. Donnelley, which was a publicly held company getting bought by Chatham, and which was in a bidding war with Atlas Holdings, which owns LSC and LSC and Lakeside Book, which is kind of ironically, which were at one time part of R.R. Donnelley before the Donnelley was split up into 3 companies back in 2016. On this year's list, Japs Olson, which was ranked number 32, which is a very old direct mail printing powerhouse that was under the stewardship of the Bedore and Murphy families for a number of years. That was acquired by private equity, a company called Monomoy Capital Partners. Also on this list for the first time, we had a company called Marketing.com, which was actually ranked number 10 with sales of $640 million. And that's been a company that has been a roll-up of acquisitions primarily by a private equity firm called JL Equity in Sarasota, Florida, led by Iran Salou. And he bought some Syndeo plants and has done several acquisitions. And the company now is headquartered in Eureka, Missouri, but it's a huge, like I say, $640 million in sales company. We see further consolidation. CJK Group continues to consolidate the book manufacturing market. But I would say, aside from CJK, the other most active industry consolidators today would be Taylor Corp in Minnesota, Matera in Iowa, BR Printers in California, and then JL Equity, like I mentioned, which is in Florida. But what's interesting too about the private equity is it's not just the big companies that they're targeting. They're starting to move further downstream. Because a lot of times in a private equity transaction, they're trying to use an acquisition as a platform from which to build off of and then do other acquisitions. So, for example, Sandy Alexander, which was ranked number 50 this year, is now owned by a company called Snow Peak Private Equity. Showdown Displays is owned by private equity. They were ranked 52. Number 64, Prismographic, is owned by Centergate Capital. So private equity is moving further downstream into the list. And I think that trend will obviously continue going forward.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure this list will continue on for many years because it is, as we said, it's just so highly anticipated and just has such an impact. But, something that our listeners, our audience might not know is how much work goes into putting together the ranking. You and I know, we know what goes into it, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what goes into putting together a ranking of this magnitude and kind of the behind the scenes look at what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge undertaking, and really takes a team effort, as you know, Ashley, because you're very involved in it. Typically we always started out sending out a printed form to update. Some years partly driven by the fact that most of us are working virtually due to the changes driven by the pandemic. Sometimes we haven't done that first mailing, but we do email blasts. We get our entire editorial team within our whole group to do follow-up emails to non-responders. We make phone calls. We've created personalized URLs so that companies can update their information online, which makes it very easy to do. But it's still hard to get companies to do it. Sometimes the information is provided by a CEO type. Sometimes it may be a CFO. Sometimes it may be a marketing person. A lot of different titles within an organization. So sometimes those people change, and trying to keep up with who the proper contact is. So it's a huge undertaking, and we start it typically in the summer, and the list literally is getting finalized really as we're putting the issue together, trying to get that 300th company to be a relatively high sales figure. Obviously there are companies that should be on the list that aren't, because as privately held companies, if a company doesn't want to participate, there's not really a way for us to get that sales information. Because as you know, sometimes we have companies fill out the form and they fill out everything but their sales. But unfortunately, if we don't have their sales figure, that's how they're ranked. So all that other information is great, but we need a sales figure to include a company.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's, I've been here with the company for 9 years, which is crazy to me, or almost 9 years. And I think when I first started, it was still all paper based. I don't think we did the digital.
It was. We didn't have the online interface set up,
right,
with the pearls, and to where companies could go directly to their listing and see what they had submitted the previous year, and then just update it online, which really help streamline the process and make it more user friendly, because back in the old days, we sent out multiple rounds of printed forms and would get back forms in the mail, and people would handwrite information in, and we'd, sometimes be trying to decipher the handwriting, what they put. And especially when it came to filling in their sales figures and numbers, and sometimes it was just very hard to read what people provided. But so yes, that was a big improvement in the process. But even with that, it still is a huge undertaking that we take a lot of pride in to produce as good a list as we can, because it's the only thing like it out there. And so it's a lot of effort, but it's a lot of satisfaction at the same time in providing that service to the industry.
Right. And I mean, I know, one of the biggest changes that you mentioned is going from, the list of 500, now we're at 300 due to, many different, different variables that have affected the list. But I'll tell you, from a production standpoint, as someone who is involved with it, I cannot imagine, it's a big effort now, but I cannot even imagine the effort to produce the list of 500 at a time when we didn't have that digital component, which now that does make it a lot easier. But, in 83, when you were producing it without that help, the digital help, I imagine it was even more difficult and challenging to pull together that list. So kudos for doing it all those years with
Yeah,
just,
it
the
was.
paper.
And we really, even for many years, had a staff position on the magazine where that person was almost dedicated to that job. We also used to produce a very thick annual directory called the Master Specifier or Master Catalog. It changed its name. So that person was involved with that because that used to get published in July, and our list, our top 300 or whichever 400, 500 list comes out every December. So we had a person dedicated to working on those two projects, and that's pretty much what they did year round.
Wow. That's yeah, I can imagine that would be definitely a full-time position at that time. And something that you mentioned that I think kind of leads into my next question, you said that this is really the only list of its kind. So, what do you think has been its cultural relevance or it's important to the industry, and how has this ranking made an impact?
Well, I'm always amazed really of the long tail of this list. Now that, we had a former competitor, Graphic Arts Monthly. They used to publish a GAM 101. But when they went out of business, and they only did the top 101 printers, where us going further into the core of the industry, I think, makes it of more value because, yes, we all know about the big behemoths in our industry, but to me, the real strength, and traditionally the real strength of our industry, has been the mid-size companies, many of which are family-owned, privately held companies, and they've been the core that, from my standpoint, have really driven our industry forward. But yeah, I mean, the long tail of the list itself, obviously it ends up getting seen by marketers and brand managers and traditional print buyers, but it really goes well beyond that. Wall Street, certainly private equity firms that are looking over the list for potential companies to target. Our list has been referenced. I've seen it over the years in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, different business publications like Crain's, and many newspapers that have referred to where a company was ranked on our list. And frankly, it's also a way for printing companies to market themselves. To say they are among the top 300 printing companies in the US and Canada ranked on sales. But it certainly extends well outside our industry in terms of people that view the list.
Right. And for a lot of companies, just anecdotally, I know that, what I've seen on social media or what I've seen in people, sometimes even in signatures, for some people, it's a badge of honor when they're on the list, and
Right.
they'll include it, I think I had someone reach out last year. It could have been, or maybe 2 years at this point, but reach out and ask if we had, little designed buttons that they could include in their email signature or on social media that said, I am number, 35 on the printing impressions 300 list. So people really, it's a badge of honor to be
Right.
included on the list. So,
And I've been seeing posts on LinkedIn, for example, of companies, that have moved up in the rankings and are, pointing that out.
mhm.
So yeah, it's really exciting to see that, and to see that the list, which, as we put so much effort into, really does have a long tail, as I said before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something, just another, thing that I've noticed, even though, the talk in the beginning with some of the changes from 40 years ago, yes, of course, there's been consolidation. Of course, there are companies that don't exist anymore. But every year, without fail, we also get companies that reach out to us after the list goes out and they say, hey, how do we get in on this? We've never been on this list before. We've never done this, but we, have $40 million in sales, or we have $10 million
Right.
in sales. There are still companies that we, maybe aren't really aware of, that are out there that would qualify to be on this list. And so there is still that excitement, and, new companies are being added every year that, like you said, marketing.com, that was one that kind of came out of, for us, I think we even flagged in the beginning, like, are they in printing? And, that was kind of a great surprise to have them on the list this year. So,
I was going to say, I mean, the list is, really like a living, breathing entity in many ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we could I'd love to see, every year from 83 and kind of put them next to each other and kind of see how it's changed. I know we've talked about wanting to kind of actually look at the 1983 version and see how it's changed from then until now.
Right.
I'd love to do that someday. So, obviously we've talked a lot about the list and kind of how it comes to be every year. So if someone who's listening has not yet looked at the list, and they want to check it out, download it, go over it, where should they go?
Well, probably the easiest way would be to go to our website, piworld.com. And on there, you'll see different places where you can link to the list and to the landing page in order to download it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. And I will include a direct link to that in the description of the podcast for easy access. So thank you, Mark, so much. I appreciate your, your expertise, your insight into this. And, this is 40 years. This is something to be really proud of. And I know you've been involved in some way since the beginning. So thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Well, thank you.
I want to give my thanks to Mark for joining me on today's episode and sharing his experiences with the Printing Impressions annual ranking. I'll include a link below to download the full list. I also want to thank all of you, our listeners. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Impressions Exchange podcast.